So, so if you have an expertise, come here so we can film you on it.
I can't film us at the same time. I'll just shout if I may. That land grant started 3D media, and the education slice on Wednesday night was part of everybody's discussion here. And I think you know Elizabeth.
Yep, very well.
Was part of the foundation.
Yes.
Her curriculum is part of the
Yeah, that's her baby. Yes, absolutely.
And one of her ideas about access, at least until maybe about it's not 50 and it's 150,
Right.
is that you have, in effect, a center that has a dozen machines, one of these local schools in the center. And the kids at other schools work on their computers or their iPads, which is a very, very useful solution. And they design, they critique, they work through all the issues as best they may. Then they take a field trip. It's called a field trip. You get on the bus, you go to the center where the dozen machines are with some additional help. And some cadre who are there to actually make sure the kids go down properly. And you have half a day. And you go back, and if you're small enough, you can pick up the kids at the same time, but otherwise they might get delivered back to the school.
Yeah.
So field tripping to the print center.
Well, that sounds great, but one concern I have is because the cost may be affordable or may not, would this be a case of the haves and the have-nots? You know, the private schools will have access to this kind of technology. The public schools, where they're overly focused on testing and teaching, you know, this may not fit into, you know, the tests the kids have to take. And will the public schools in the poorer areas where the parents can't supplement what the schools provide, will they fall very far behind because they won't have access to this kind of technology?
So the policy initiative is figure out how to fund getting this technology into the schools.
Yeah.
Because I think, you know, in my world, a lot of the manufacturing people, both on a national level and locally, have been talking about the STEM gap.
Yes.
And the importance of engaging kids in STEM. You only have to go to the Maker Faire to see that this is turning that whole equation around.
Yes.
And in fact, I heard of a school recently where they had one in a second grade classroom. So that's the age you want to get kids excited about math and about science. And this
Yes.
is no better way to do it.
Yes.
So the question isn't if, it's got to be how.
Okay.
How do we do this? And he's probably, MakerBot's probably done more thinking, I would guess, about around that issue or through the foundation.
Yeah, I mean, the foundation has been doing a lot of great stuff with that, which I have not been as involved with, recently on. So I'm not sure what their sort of current state of thinking is on that. But from the MakerBot end of things, I mean, yeah, we spend a lot of time talking to schools and trying to sell into schools and trying to work with them to figure out the best way to get them into the schools and try to we can't give away printers, but we definitely provide an education discount and try to work with them on that. On the university level, we're seeing amazing stuff happening in places like Berkeley, and Virginia Tech is doing some amazing stuff with MakerBot, so with 3D printing in general. And we've seen some interesting kind of businesses starting to spin out of university programs. There's both Virginia Tech and Berkeley actually separately came up, two different sort of organizations, but came up with sort of 3D printing vending machine concepts, which are really, really cool. Dreambox is the one out of Berkeley, and it's got four MakerBots in it. It's a vending machine kind of concept, and the students can email in the file that they want printed, and it prints it in there and has a little arm that knocks it off the build platform, and then actually text messages them a code that unlocks a little compartment where the print has fallen, and they can come and pick it up. And they're seeing, tremendous pickup in all, first it was like the design kids, and then the architecture kids got into it, and then the art, it spread through the university, and so lots of people are using it. And they're actually trying to develop a ruggedized version of the vending machine to bring into developing countries with preloaded design files, like water filters and certain parts that would be useful in an environment like that. So there's some really cool business models being spun out of the universities when they start engaging, even in the lower ed.
The other night, one of your colleagues from the foundation
Yeah.
was speaking, and he talked to the issue of training teachers
Yes.
to be able to use these tools as learning opportunities in the classroom, and that was one of the biggest gaps. So it's not only getting equipment into the classroom, it's then how do you use it when you get there?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, that's-
a huge training issue.
That's
Okay.
definitely the second part of the equation, and what we heard is there were many schools that actually have a MakerBot, and it's, the original one, it's still sitting in the box because they, first of all, didn't figure out how to put it together, and then there's no one who knows how to use it.
Okay.
Or once they figure out how to use it, the first thing they do is they just go online and they download a file and they print something and they go, okay, well, what was the learning lesson in that?
Uh-huh,
So there's, there's three pieces of it. It's get the equipment, train the teachers, and have the right kind of curriculum that actually results in a good learning experience.
Okay, so there needs to be training all around, for sure. We're joined by Jordan Brandt. Thanks for showing up. Why don't you just give us a couple of minutes on what you do and your view of the 3D technology and its future applications?
Great. Well, I apologize for the tardiness, but thanks for the opportunity to come in. I am Jordan Brandt. I'm a futurist from Autodesk. And my role is to look at trends that are shaping the environment of designing and making things specifically. And obviously, additive manufacturing and 3D printing is a big piece of that. I think there's right now an interesting convergence going on with some broader social and technological trends. You think of crowd power, crowdsourced design, crowdfunding, converging with 3D printing and even 4D printing. And we can get into that if you guys would like to. And then automation, which is kind of a scary word sometimes, but the thought of not only automation traditionally in robotics and factories that we think of, but also automation in the way that we design and augmenting designers to automate things. So these are all kind of coming into a sweet spot right now where they're mutually beneficial, where crowds can now define the goods and products that they want for their specific locality. And we can enable the manufacturing at a much more local level with additive and be able to leverage automation where it makes sense to augment the worker rather than supplanting the worker.
Right.
So that's kind of the area that I'm focused on now, and I spent a great week here in New York talking about this topic a lot, so it's been fun.
Yeah, we've heard a bit about that. That's actually a concern, that the not supplanting the worker. And that's a worry that people who just have a brief overview have, that it's going to just destroy manufacturing as we know it, and that there won't be jobs because machines will do it, and only highly skilled engineers and people who can write software or deal with the machines will be able to be employed. But you say no.
I think there's a good reason for optimism. I don't know if you guys have had the discussion of reshoring versus newshoring yet? Is
No.
that introduced? Okay. So in the event that NY3DP had in
Yes.
Brooklyn earlier this week, we're talking about the idea of reshoring, that there is manufacturing returning to the United States. And
And specifically, how we can encourage its growth here in New York State.
exactly. And we're seeing a lot of this localization coming back. So I would say that the reshoring that we're seeing is a symptom of distributed manufacturing or localized manufacturing,
Okay.
right? From a national policy perspective, we say reshoring because we think of jobs coming back. But in reality, the production is just getting closer to the consumer. And obviously with 10 plus million consumers right here that have very specific and very tasteful needs, let's say,
is
it's
New York
ripe
City.
for, yeah, exactly. It's ripe for disruption. And that's why we're seeing so many pockets of this activity happening. But we prefer now to use the term nearshoring because reshoring is misleading, and this is what we read about in the popular media. But it leads the public to believe that the jobs that we lost are coming back, and that the products that we outsourced are coming back. And the truth
Right.
is, those jobs are gone.
Yeah.
These are new jobs that are being created. These are new products that are being created. And a great analogy is you could think of the cheap plastic lawn chair. It's what, $5 per lawn chair, and they make them in quantities of 10 million. We're not getting those back, but what we are getting back is the customized lawn chair that you design online and have printed in your local facility and go pick up. So the two will go hand in hand. Increasingly, we're seeing that consumers are starting to demand something that's made for them. And that's where additive really plays a big role.
Yeah, did you want to say something about that? No. Yeah.
So there was a study done recently by Georgia Tech where they surveyed small manufacturing firms across the country. And part of the results of that study were that innovative companies, A, are more profitable, B, pay way higher wages than companies who are just looking at how to make the cheapest. And these are tools, low-cost tools that help companies to be truly innovative. So I think you want to look at this as this is a tool that can help us create more jobs, create more profits, create more products.
Yeah, I would agree. And the other thing I think with, just talking about just creating jobs, New York, I think, is
You're a
going
good
back
example.
to, well, yeah, and New York in general has become this leading center for 3D printing. I mean, just in New York, MakerBot is here, obviously, Shapeways, Solid Doodle. There's a lot of talent here. The talent mix is right in New York for this industry. The proximity to top designers in the fashion industry and architecture and all these things, it's all here in New York. And anything that can be done to, we were, at MakerBot, we were fortunate enough to be able to find good space down in Sunset Park for our production facility when we moved out of our original facility that was down in Guanas. And being able to manufacture the printers so close to the actual office where the engineers are is just invaluable. Being able to, whatever, we need to change something, it's a 20-minute subway ride and we can be at the factory. And it's incredibly important for us. Anything that can be done to encourage more, printer manufacturers or any of the related industries that spring up around that, like such as Shapeways or design companies, filament production, making the actual plastic, any of those things, it's new jobs that can be created here.
But
I
how
mean,
many
this-
company,
Go ahead,
sorry,
yeah.
how many employees do you now have? I mean, we talked about this earlier.
we mentioned this earlier, so I'll just, for context, I started at MakerBot in November, so I've almost been there a year, and when I started, I was around the 120th employee, and we were based in a garage, a couple garages that the walls had been knocked out in Guanas, in Brooklyn. It wasn't the most glamorous office, but it was a true startup facility, and we just recently broke about I think around 340 mark, and that's just since November, and we're on pace to grow significantly more. And now we've moved into a new, beautiful office in Metrotech Center in downtown Brooklyn, running out of space. We have lots of folding tables everywhere because we're running out of space for the employees in that office, and we have a new facility in Sunset that we opened. So, and I think you talk to most companies in this industry, and you're going to hear similar stories. Shapeways, I know, has grown significantly and opened. They're still in the process of fully opening their production facility in Long Island City. They have offices in Manhattan as well. So across the board, companies in the 3D printing industry right now are growing at insane rates and creating a lot of jobs. We also one other thing I want to add to that, with our acquisition and now merger with Stratasys. I don't have the fact on this in front of me, but it was without a doubt one of the largest exits for a startup company in New York. I mean, it brought a significant amount of money to the city by, it was a real successful startup exit. And that's good for the tech scene in New York in general, set aside the 3D printing part, but just the startup ecosystem in New York, that's going to attract a lot more venture capital investment, a lot more interest and talent from around the country. So it's a good time for New York right now for not just the 3D printing industry, but the tech industry in general.
Well, that kind of brings me to the third, final large question we're going to handle here. What are the public policy issues when thinking about this technology, and what can government, or what does government need to do to encourage it, to not hamper it, but to, there must be needs for some kinds of safeguards. There's the gun example, but there's also counterfeit products, there's intellectual property, there's products liability issues, there's environmental issues, when you brought up the plastic burning, the safety and environmental issues. So those are broad questions, but, I'd like to, if possible, get some ideas for legislation or guidance for state government about how to encourage this technology and see what we need to do to help it grow.
I think one area would definitely be intellectual property, where government collaboration could help greatly.
Okay.
And this ranges from IP surrounding an individual designs something and others use it. How is that individual rewarded for that work? But also the ease with which we can now capture reality. So I could scan this microphone and becoming a concern
Okay.
in this space. I mean, and the thing is, there's nothing new here. And we've been through it before with the media industry. And what seems odd right now, we're kind of quagmired in the analogy of going from CDs to MP3s to the streaming Spotify generation.
Right.
We're kind of stuck in this MP3 generation right now,
Okay.
where there's a lot of file sharing going on, which harkens back to the thoughts of Napster. And
Right.
so there's some technological development, which the burden is on, MakerBot and Autodesk and the startups who are providing the technologies, but also the guidance around how do we shore up the intellectual property and security for sharing the data and then making sure that people, like I said, are remunerated accordingly with their work.
Yeah, interestingly enough, there were 3 different articles I saw this morning. I didn't get a chance to read them all about IP. So it seems like it's the topic of the week, perhaps. There's certainly things that companies will probably start doing. So, music industry is a really good example. So, one article that I saw, a suggestion was being made that, all consumer products companies should start providing the designs to the public and do that for a price. And so instead of selling the item, you're selling the design. That's certainly at the commercial level, but from a government level, it's always been a very tricky situation. IP protection and changing law around that is a very difficult thing. So it is going to have to be, I think, on the enforcement side. How do you tackle that, and do you go after, the guy in his living room who's just making the item for the handle for the refrigerator, or do you focus your efforts on, sort of the bigger players who may be infringing?
We have an interesting, situation at MakerBot because we have our Thingiverse platform where we're sharing the files, and the interesting part about it is that, is how few instances we have of any sort of violation. And when anything does happen, we have a standard takedown process. We get a notice and it's reviewed by our legal team. And if it's found to infringe in any way, we take it down. And it happens very rarely. And the community is very good at self-policing themselves and respecting. Most items on Thingiverse are uploaded under a Creative Commons license. So there's different flavors of Creative Commons, but essentially, you can download it, modify the file, put it back up, just attribute it to the original designer. And by and large, the community respects those, that licensing scheme. And so just based on the behavior we see from our users, we don't see a huge looming problem in that area on a site like Thingiverse.
But those are, it's a small community that's very invested in this. As it spreads out to the general public, do you think they follow those same rules?
Yeah, I mean, we just haven't seen it. I mean, there's a huge difference between, you know, me trying to reproduce this water bottle, and, you know, I assume it was something that, you know, they cared more about the copyright. I mean, the effort that would take in the 3D printed version that would result, they're not, you know, it's sort of a Xerox effect. You know, even with our scanner that we've just, released, it's just not quite to the point where you're reproducing the actual physical object with all the properties and, you know, we feel like the issue's probably mildly, you know, has been hyped a little possibly too far
Yeah.
as of right now. The other interesting thing, and this to your point about consumer companies embracing it, we did a deal with a partnership with Nokia where they provided us with the CAD file for the back panel of 2 of their smartphones. And we optimized it for 3D printing and then built a web app so you could customize it and do some things with it. And then we made that available for free on Thingiverse, and Nokia promoted it heavily. And they made the decision that they weren't going to lose anything by doing this. You know, people would still have to buy the phone. You weren't reproducing the whole phone. You were just reproducing, not the case, but the actual, you know, back panel of the phone. So it was a piece of the hardware, but not an electrical part or anything like that. And so we see more interest from large companies in figuring out intelligent ways to engage with 3D printing and get the benefits from it. And they're really interested in it. And that was a really good partnership with them.
So we've been at John Jay. You know, I'm fortunate enough to work with a team of people that have been studying policy effects on 3D printing for quite some time now, and we have a working paper that we're almost finished with, ready to publish. But one of the things that I kind of find unique about this, or maybe it's not unique, maybe it's more common than anything, is that when we're looking at policy concerns involving 3D printing, there are different groups that, or stakeholders or group masses that will get involved. One of them is the industry, and I think that's kind of like the top priority right now, because I do think, as Cody brought up, that the industry needs to self-regulate certain things, whether or not it's being forced to do so by government. And as the industry itself self-regulates its website, self-regulates what it's able to sell and what the capabilities of these devices are, I think that the industry could allay many of our concerns. But then there's also there's also government out there. And when I'm looking at government, I'm looking at it from both the federal level and state level. And I think they play 2 very different and distinct roles in trying to manage policies involving 3D printing. And as I said in the beginning, I think that one of the top priorities when government gets involved is being able to make sure that this industry could thrive while dealing with certain policy concerns, whether it's for safety and security or other types of policy concerns. It needs to be able to deal with those concerns. From the state level, for example, I think that a lot of what we were talking about when it comes to intellectual property, I think a lot of that falls in the federal government. I mean, they have exclusive control over trademark and copyright, and I think the federal government really needs to pay close attention, just like they did with the DCMA with the music industry. But I think they really need to pay really close attention on intellectual property. But from the state level, we have a whole host of things that the state belongs getting involved with. For example, economic development funding and support. A lot of that's on the state and the local level. How could the state encourage people to participate in the 3D printing revolution or movement? And whether it's tax incentives or whether it's certain purchase incentives or direct investment, as California did with a lot of Silicon Valley. So how could New York invest from a policy point of view? So I think investment and funding is a big one. Safety and security, again, is a big one. I do agree that the industry could regulate a lot of the dark side of this, but not 100%. And people will eventually need to be comfortable that what is being sold is at least regulated in some ways that keep people safe and secure. We're lucky in New York State. In New York State, we have gunsmithing laws already. So, we're one up than some of the other states out there that don't have gunsmithing laws. You cannot legally go and print a plastic firearm in New York State and do anything with it. You can't carry it around, you can't use it. 2.5 years ago, we had a teleconference with the ATF when we first started realizing the capabilities. And the one thing we learned is federally, the law is not where it needs to be when it comes to protecting against some of these issues. But in New York State, we're much better off.
But at some point, metal will be used in this.
Absolutely, yeah.
So what do we need to do when
Sorry,
that
can I just
happens?
jump in real quick?
Yeah.
I wish Michael Weinberg was here. We've had some really good discussions. Really? Oh, well, maybe I'll leave it. But, we've discussed this a few times, and I think the key issue in all this is that legislating and focusing too much on the technology
Yeah.
is a mistake.
I agree with you.
It's not how the gun is made, it's the gun. Because you can never keep up with the way technology evolves.
So the rules and the laws that apply to guns will just apply to differently
And-
manufactured guns.
Let me give a corollary, something that I've been thinking a lot about. You would need the cooperation of the industry to do things, but there are certain things, technologies that could be used to make 3D printing more safe and secure from a law enforcement point of view. And one of the ideas that we've had, and hopefully it won't make people cringe too much, if you look at what was done in the ink industry, pushed a lot by the Secret Service during the Cold War era. In the pen and the ink industry, they found ways to do like date tagging within ink, and most people don't even know this exists. But ever since the Cold War, the Secret Service has worked with ink manufacturing companies, and a large percent, not 100%, it's not the law, it's best practice, a large percent of the ink that you'll buy for your pens or for your printers, they have certain radio tagging within the ink. And let's say somebody makes a ransom letter or a hostage letter and they send it off. Well, you could actually analyze the ink and be able to tell when the ink was manufactured, who sold it, where it was sold, and it's an extremely inexpensive process. So one of the things that we've been contemplating is, could radio tagging be put into the plastics? So that, it makes people more comfortable where if you have to do a law enforcement investigation going forward, it doesn't require registration, it doesn't require licensing, it doesn't require any of the things that would hamper an industry. But simple radio tagging of the types of ABS and PLA, plastics that we're using all the time, could that help piece together an investigation if an incident would occur? And what would be the actual costs in putting them into play and putting them into effect? It's almost a negligible fee to add some of these radio tags to plastics, and it might not hamper the industry. So, we could always look at innovative ways to use technology to help us without being able to restrict the growth of the movement.
But, guns, for example, you have to, when you buy them, you undergo background checks and all of that. If you make one for yourself, how would anyone know about it?
It's not only guns that worry me.
No.
From a public safety point of view, printing out a dagger, for example, and bringing it into a courthouse, or bringing it into a school.
Right.
Most of our security today is built around metal detectors, but now we could print, fairly sharp objects right from a 3D printer. So I think that Cody's right in that we need to look less at the specific technology and more about what people are doing with these things. But legislation might need to be passed one day that just like you can't make your own gun at home in New York State, you can't make your own dagger at home in New York State. So I think that these are all really good questions that hopefully the industry could work with government and kind of lead some of these conversations going forward.
It goes much broader, even thinking about product liability. If I design a replacement part for a car and it becomes wildly popular and suddenly people are installing it in their car and there was some flaw in my design,
Exactly.
how do we know? And I think there's a lot to what we call the watermarking. We actually have a team of researchers looking at how to watermark prints from the design file that is sent, actually just using voids, and think of like a QA code in 3 dimensions with voids that you could scan with an MRI or a sonogram that could actually indicate this came from this machine at this time at this place, very specifically. And it does apply to something much broader than designing something for nefarious purposes. I'm trying to help But suddenly what happens if my design is flawed in some way?
Exactly,
What's the UL
exactly.
equivalent for these products?
Yeah, and I think part of that is going to have to be public education, because we know that commercial companies that are making parts for automobiles have to meet certain ANSI standards and various things. They have to mark their products in such a way. But I think the public has, a general belief that those companies are doing what they should be doing. Now, if I go and I buy Jordan's part, do I know what I should be looking for to make sure that that small business did the same thing? So I think that it's going to be an education issue. But I do think that the current regulations around consumer product safety are adequate to cover what we need. The question is, how do they get applied again to the small producer? Because, for instance, Etsy right now, which is, handcrafted goods, is getting away, or I don't mean that in a negative way, but, they say these are handcrafted, so you're buying a handcrafted item. Well, 3D printed items, especially in certain segments. I come from toys and games and make products for kids, and it's heavily, heavily regulated. 5 or so years ago, Consumer Protection Safety Act came around. Companies have to follow that. A lot of small businesses had a very difficult time doing that because that regulation was aimed at larger businesses that have the capital to be able to meet all of the regulations. So how do we take those, very good policies and apply them to the smaller business?
And this is a business opportunity. We've been talking about, how do you reward people for the work that they've contributed in the designs? And I think you're going to see this bifurcation much as you do in digital media. People happily go to iTunes and pay for quality content. I know it's legal, I know it's high quality, and I'm willing to pay for that. I think people will be willing to pay for original designs that are regulated, that they know are safe. And there's going to be another group that are use at your own risk. That this was an individual, I'm not a professional, I'm claiming that. You print it in your house, have fun with it, but I'm not guaranteeing it in any way. So this is an opportunity for the retailers and for small businesses to come up and say, we're going to offer you proven, tested, quality goods, and we're going to exchange that for a price. And I think we're going to see this trajectory happen in business and 3D printing as a whole.
I think that's a good point. Someone earlier was talking about proactive versus reactive law, but when it comes to digital files and piracy, what we've learned with media has been that one reason there was this consumer versus company battle in the media space was that consumers wanted something companies weren't providing. They wanted singles, and then in a lot of places they wanted to see the digital movies or read the ebooks before they were sold in the marketplace. And so when companies got better at giving consumers what they wanted, the rate of piracy went down. It's actually declined because most people are okay paying if they're getting what they want and they're getting some kind of value add. And so I think your point's a really good one, that most people will pay if they're getting a certified design file, if they're saving themselves time and hassle, and it's a good enough price point that they don't have to spend all the time packing and making an illegal copy. So I think that there are a lot of nuances in this discussion, and again, I think it comes down to separating goodwill from the bad guys, the real malice, and there's different policies for both.
The real bad guys, I think, in my point of view, looking at it as such black and white as good versus bad is problematic, because I think a lot of the risk here, a lot of the problems will come from people who we wouldn't traditionally consider a bad person. A child fooling around at home, for example, could wind up causing a very significant amount of damage when they bring their 3D printed handgun into their school. And I think that some of this gray area is the area that's going to cause so much grief.
What about, tax incentives, as you mentioned, or investment? On what kind of scope do you think government needs to be involved? I mean, it seems to be marching along without government intervention here, but at some point, we will need government to set aside maybe different zones maybe Governor's Island could be one spot. People have suggested that as a medical research area, for example. But, so what
Right.
does government need to do to help encourage in places where it needs
There's a-
that encouragement?
There's a really interesting dynamic happening in Singapore right now, where and Singapore has its own sort of unique situation, but where the government of Singapore has set aside, a huge chunk of money for developing technology companies, in specific additive manufacturing, because they feel like they've sort of missed the boat on it a little bit. And one of the things they're doing is they're fronting around 85% of the money to Singaporean-based venture capital funds to invest in technology and in specific 3D printing companies. And then after a 3-year period, that VC group has the option to buy back that chunk of that massive government investment. So what they're doing is, instead of the government just directly pushing money into 3D printing, they're pushing it into it through the venture capitalists. And so they're encouraging investment that way. And, again, Singapore's a very different place than New York, but I think encouraging investment in the industry. There's plenty of talent in New York, and there's plenty of very creative people with great ideas, and making it easier for them to get access to funds would be very helpful. I don't know how that works on the legislative end, but
I
just
would also say
conceptually.
that we need earlier stage funding.
Okay.
That there's much greater need. The VCs aren't really looking, even when they've gotten, and some of them have gotten state money
Right.
in order to be able to do, but they're not really doing that earlier stage, high-risk capital.
And why aren't they?
It's not where their appetite, their comfort zone, anything is. It's much further down. So angels
Uh-huh.
sometimes, but that's much harder to figure out how to access. There's a seed fund. We've got one seed fund in new media, but it's not an internet kind of place. But they don't do physical products.
It's a hardware issue. Hardware
It's a
versus software.
hardware-
The
it's a
investment community is
hardware
much
issue.
more comfortable investing in
Yeah.
software because it's scalable, and they worry that at some point you're going to have to move your manufacturing somewhere else to make it cost effective. So it's a hard sell.
And I think, for these smaller companies, the tax breaks. I mean, we used to have a reimbursable tax credit in our state.
Yeah.
And that did actually work fairly well for small firms. But I think now you've got to actually make a profit before you, and have taxable revenues before you benefit from the tax the credits. And earlier stage firms, which I think is what we're talking about encouraging, can't really take advantage of that. So they need cash now. And so how do we find a way to get some seed money into them earlier so that before they wither and die?
Okay.
What about an addition of incentivizing the suppliers, the hardware manufacturers, material producers? What about the consumers? What about generating the demand? What if we had a program where there was a rebate for printing replacement parts, a sustainability initiative, a recycling initiative? What if you had a Filabot, which is a machine that you can recycle bottles and plastics and produce filament for your MakerBot or printer? There's incentives to do that. And instead of throwing away the microwave that you can't use because there's a broken button, you replace that button. And simultaneously you educate them in how to do this so that I think right now we're in a situation, like on Thingiverse, you have an amazing community. I'm part of that community, I love it. We need to extend that to the people who are not the nerds who are into 3D printing for the sake of 3D printing. In order to see this explosion and the opportunities in New York to grow, we need this to come to every home. And how do we incentivize homes to do that?
Right.
There's already compelling numbers coming out that there's an ROI on 3D printers. In a year's time, you can get the value back that you put into the capital expenditure by printing replacement parts or new items for your home. And I think if you wrap that up into a sustainability initiative, say, hey, instead of coming up to pick up the recycling, why don't you put that into a machine and print out new stuff?
I mean, aren't some of these objects, are planned obsolescence so that the companies can continue to get your dollar? And this would be contrary to their business model if you could just print something to fix it.
Not if they're selling you the digital files that
Okay.
are certified and guaranteed to function. And then we cut down on that entire supply chain of me now throwing this stuff away
Right.
and getting new plastic that comes from Saudi Arabia or Venezuela and is converted into the filament and ultimately gets delivered to my home. The material's already in my home. So this requires obviously a new business model for the major retailers
That's
and
right.
providers, but this is that new digital supply chain that we're looking at.
I would say a couple of other things. I mean, one, I just want to make sure that education and training and getting 3D printers into schools is down
Yes.
on the list.
Yes.
But the second thing is that we need to educate state administrative people across the board, because there are opportunities, and if they're not educated about it, they'll miss them. So NYSERDA, the dormitory authority, the people who actually procure a lot of stuff. So you don't want them putting up a lot of kind of RFP barriers. No parts may be made by 3D printers. You got to have them open. So I think it's, that's a fairly low-cost thing, but educate the bureaucrats.
Yeah, would bureaucrats, I guess, would largely be informed by existing businesses that are not educated, that they have a role in the future? And they might be saying, watch out for this 3D printer technology. It's not good for us. And so they will want to protect the existing,
Maybe?
I mean, I see that,
Yeah.
keep the status quo, in
Of
other
course.
words.
Of course.
Someone,
Yeah.
the CEO of a X1, a big 3D printing, or not that big actually, publicly traded 3D printing company that prints in sand and metal and all this stuff. He said once that the real competition in the 3D printing industry was not internally with other 3D printing companies, but the competition is with traditional manufacturing methods. Not all of traditional manufacturing, but with specific use cases. So, programs to educate manufacturers on areas that they can add value by 3D printing, I think would be extremely valuable.
So there needs to be education all around.
Lots of
All
things.
around, okay.
And I like the word education rather than training. Maybe
Yeah.
that's a pet peeve, but it feels like with 3D printing, the ability there is to design and create your own things. And training says you're going to be focused on doing this thing.
Right.
And this technology is antithetical to that idea. It's opening the opportunity to do whatever you can imagine.
Yeah,
So I
yeah,
think
yeah.
education is the right word to
All
use
right.
with 3D printing.
That's the word we'll use here. We've been joined by Michael Weinberg, who's the Vice President of Public Knowledge. And I know you were stuck on a train or,
Yes, the best thing that anyone can do to help the future of 3D printing is fund Amtrak.
which unfortunately,
Creates an
European
energy for the
countries
rails.
do fund.
I know,
it.
I know.
They're not us. So,
I apologize
No,
profusely.
we're at the very tail end, but since you're here, and I thank you for being here, perhaps you can, give us your experience and your predictions for the future, or what the state or just government in general can do to encourage and enhance the 3D technology.
Sure, and I will be brief because I know this should probably be over already, and I apologize. So, as you said, I work for an organization called Public Knowledge. We're a public interest group in DC. We represent consumers in technology policy, and so when we think about 3D printing, we see a new, empowering, but disruptive news stories or changes that involve 3D printing, and there's always an instinct to say, well, there's this new technology, maybe what we need to do is find sort of new specific laws for 3D printing. And it may in fact be that that is the case, but to rush to that has the potential to have a huge number of unintended adverse consequences. And so I think actually the most important thing is probably to be sort of cognizant of the fact that any sort of government reaction is one that can cut both ways, and so to go slow. That being said, I think there's a huge amount of opportunity. I'm sure I am repeating everything that everyone has already said, but in bringing the technology forward, and that comes in a lot of ways. I mean, one is obviously creating an environment where a lot of these companies are startup companies, and they started small, and so being able to get space, get access to people, get access to capital, and do it I want to say safely, but do it in an environment that really fosters that, has been incredibly beneficial to 3D printing. I think that's one of the reasons that you're seeing New York as such a center for 3D printing. Another is not necessarily as an advocate in government for 3D printing, but to take the opportunities as they come. I mean, this is a great technology for all sorts of things. It's a great technology for manufacturing. It's a great technology for education. And so when someone comes to you and says, we had this idea for this new technology, and there may be a role for government to, in education, to kind of help us bring it to schools, or to kind of clear the way so we can really try out these new things, to be supporters of that. So the super short version is, first of all, don't overreact to change, which is not to say don't react to change, but to go slowly and carefully, and then be really open to novelty and to innovation, and to the extent that there's something new, that especially if it's a small idea or a small kind of pilot program, to make sure that it's clear that your doors are open for that, so people can feel comfortable trying out those new things and using, especially New York, not as a petri dish in the negative way, but in a real place to try out new ideas and new ways of building or teaching or tinkering or whatever, or what have you. So, like I said, I'm sure it has been said much more eloquently than everyone, but.
Well, this was the third question in the panel. What can we do to encourage and not to stifle it, but are there areas where we need regulation? And it sounds like you're saying it's too soon to know that.
Yeah, at least in my experience thus far, which is again not to say that there will never be, but I have yet to see a policy challenge or a regulatory challenge connected to 3D printing where asking the question, was this possible without 3D printing? And investigating the world as it existed and was regulated before that didn't result in saying, okay, I think we have this under control. I think one of the, and I talk to people about this all the time, you know, when you see that new policy question, 3D printing, whatever it is, I think it's incumbent on everyone, but especially lawmakers, to ask that question, what was happening before 3D printing? Because it may be that the answer is nothing, and we're in a whole new world and we need to build it from scratch. But so far the answer has been, well, at least some of this has been happening before. And let's make sure we understand what the current state of the law and regulation is, even if it's an area that we don't pay attention to because it's out of our area of focus for whatever reason, before we move forward. Because there's such an opportunity, because 3D printing kind of brings you into new things, to discover something new and say, oh, well, something must be done, without necessarily realizing that something has been done, but it wasn't on your radar before. And that's certainly been the case for me, and I know there have been people I've talked to who have gone through that same process.
I mean, I think in general, government lags far behind technology. I mean, there was surrogacy long before there were laws about surrogate parenting, and you know, that whole area still is a developing area of law, although it's prospering out in the world. So I think we shouldn't worry that much because government is slow and things take a long time, but that's a benefit. But in terms of providing tax credits and things like that, I think government needs to step up to encourage this technology.
There's one more thing relating back to a comment that we had before, and it relates to your taxes and credits. So if I need a new light switch for my apartment, I have some choices. One choice is to go to Home Depot and purchase a light switch and pay sales tax to Home Depot. Another option is to go online and deal with a vendor in California who will ship me my light switch with no sales tax, or at least I should pay it myself, but most people don't. So the question is, what's going to happen in the realm of New York State sales tax? And over time, how will it affect New York State and local revenues if I'm printing out a switch at home, which I'm not paying any sales tax on for the final product? Am I buying this locally, or am I ordering it, and am I paying, any sales tax whatsoever throughout the entire process? So I think that one area that the state could examine over time is not only how 3D printing will affect sales tax in the 2, 5, 10-year, forecasts, but perhaps in order to incentivize consumers, which is something that we think is very important, sales tax, or the lack of having to pay sales tax, could be an incentive, save $1 by printing it out at home. I don't have to go to Home Depot and pay my sales tax. And that could help the entire industry as well. But, it's very local and very localized. So that's just something to keep in mind.
I think we're running out of time, unfortunately, and I know we could go on for a longer time. Maybe we can reconvene sometime down the road, but I wonder if you'd just like to give short summary statements.
I think from a policy perspective, it's already been said, but for the most part, there's legislation covering products, no matter how they're made. 3D printing is just another new way of making it. From my perspective, the question is, how do we make sure that we protect consumers? And I think that can be done through some of the ideas that have been thrown out by making sure that the designs are approved and through education purposes. I do think that New York City and New York State is very well situated to be a hub of all of this activity, and not just 3D printing, but 3D printing as a part of the bigger whole. Given the fashion industry, the medical design, the design capabilities here are a key to all of that, and it's really a matter of having the right incentives to be able to keep that here.
Thank you. Sarah?
Yeah, I think two things. One, we've got sort of more, what I call the more mature companies who I think need a education about how the technology could drive their own innovation, and they need support. And they're a place where you could use tax incentives, but they need the support to actually acquire the equipment, and I think for most of them it's not a MakerBot, it is larger, more robust systems. And they're going to need help in training, but they do need help in training as well as they integrate those processes into their company. On the earlier stage companies, I do feel that there is a need to help those companies to scale their manufacturing and to do it in New York State. So we have to figure out how to incentivize both the more mature companies and the early stage companies to make it in New York State, and to provide some support sort of programmatically to making those matches and building those kind of supply chains.
Thank you.
Okay, I think the goal is, we probably all agree, is proactive and informed regulation, and that includes education, not training for all. And I think that a really good question, as Michael was saying, is 3D printing enabling something new? And if the answer is no, this is simply an extension of something that has already existed, or is it simply a lowering of barriers to entry for something that has already existed, then that should also inform the policy. But I think if you look at, particularly in consumer safety, there's a very interesting blend of the Department of Food Safety, the USDA, and then Yelp. And this is a very powerful combination when it comes to the success of restaurants.
That's interesting.
I think we should incentivize New Yorkers to become their own mini factories by educating them, perhaps turning libraries into public maker spaces, and by giving them a 5-cent bottle rebate to recycle and print in their own homes.
Sounds good.
I think the number one thing, from this is sort of settled in my head as we've been talking, is the schools. And I think that's probably where it all starts.
Yeah.
And that's the most sustainable long-term solution, is to push it into, whatever, the state government can do to support getting the printers into schools and getting teachers trained in how to use them effectively. And I think that will roll outwards from there, particularly into, as they go out then and start their professional careers, they'll be able to bring that into, and it'll make them a lot more employable to use those too. 3D printing is not going anywhere. And so that I think that'll have a roll-on effect. The other thing, we kind of glossed over this a little bit, but there's things going on at the federal level with additive manufacturing, the National Additive Manufacturing Institute, there's programs coming out of that anything that could be done to steer any of that money towards New York State, or to support New York-based companies in applying for some of those grants or getting involved with that, I think would be beneficial. And then the last thing, I said this when we started, and I just want to reiterate it, that as things kind of come to your attention, or to your colleagues' attention, that you read in the newspaper and you get panicked emails about 3D printers are making dangerous things or whatever, tap into the industry and talk to the people here and other people in the industry, and just get that other side of the story and what's really going on, because there's a lot of hype and there's a lot of misinformation out there about the industry, so it's important to really keep in touch with the people who are closest to it.
I would say, as a legislator, especially, and we try and do this at the federal level. This is as far as I know, the first time that I'm aware of that there is a state level anything investigation into 3D printing, and so I really want to commend you of that. I mean, we do all sorts of education, mostly at the federal level, and it is a challenge often to get legislators to pay attention to something that is not yet at crisis level. And I'm serious though, getting information about it before it is in the context of a legislative contest is probably the most important thing that lawmakers can do. You are going to get information from a wide range of people. They're going to be giving it to you for all sorts of reasons, but if you can come before it comes to a head, and really try and bring a bunch of people together and understand the technology, understand the companies and the people who are using it, then when you have that moment in the future, 3D printing isn't going anywhere. When someone says we have a challenge related to 3D printing, you can come into it with a depth of understanding that allows you to really make sensible policy. And I understand that is a really hard thing to do as a legislator, because there are a lot of things that are need to do now, but the ability to recognize and take some time to do that is probably the most important thing. And so I'm really sad that I missed most of this. I'm really happy that you did this, and I hope that there are many more, both here and frankly nationwide, where we see that level of engagement before we are in the middle of a fun but horrible legislative battle.
Right, thank you. Frank?
So I want to say thank you for inviting me. It was a great discussion. I learned a lot from all you guys. And I think from the consumer perspective, I think, for this to really reach mainstream and be a success, I think four things need to happen. Obviously, first is the price. I think still we're at a point where it's a little high for this mainstream market. So whether that's through incentives, like Jordan said, or just the price naturally come down, I think we're a little bit far away. You mentioned a return on investment. Afterwards, I'd like to talk to you about seeing that study. But another thing is some sort of safety kind of requirements, like I mentioned, with whatever these fumes with the plastics are, or the ability to burn yourself, I think definitely need to be addressed before kids are using this, or even parents that aren't too technical savvy. And then a third area, which wasn't, we talked about briefly, was the time of these prints. And I think that it's okay that they take long, but what we need is a better confidence level that we're going to get a good print. So when I was printing, I didn't feel so comfortable to let it run overnight, or really to walk away from it too much, because if you did get a failed print, you could not ruin your printer, but you're going to add more work for yourself, whether it's cleaning the jet, or just maintenance procedures that, you know, it's a time sink. So no one really talked about that in terms of monetizing or what labor costs would be, but it is an important issue. So until you're able to kind of print this thing and walk away, I think that's another reason mainstream might not get into it. And lastly, like everyone said, it really is an educational issue. We need people to kind of really take charge and get this into our schools so that, you know, we really have engineers thriving in the States. You know, I'm an engineer myself. I have a passion for it, and I just love to see that really come back to the States. And I think, you know, someone mentioned about automation and taking away jobs, but to me, I feel that these are the jobs we want in the country. They're higher paying, and it's not always that it's going to remove jobs. At least in my company, I do a lot of the automation for the labs, and it's not to get jobs out of the company. It's to increase our speed of work and to get information to our consumers at a faster rate. And it's not about losing jobs. It's about doing a better job. So that's what I have to say. And again, thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me and hosting this at John Jay College. I think from a policy point of view, I could summarize my comments by saying that I think we're on good footing. I think both on federal and state level that the legislation is right for where we are now. But I do think that now is the time, and it's good that we're here doing this, to start talking about medium and long-term policy issues. And as the technology really matures, how the legislation needs to change to support the maturing technologies. I think this is the right time not only to start looking at how to incentivize and fund consumer-based 3D printing, but also to fund policy studies and technical studies to have a good third-party idea, or at least an unbiased idea of how the policies and technologies need to develop as well. And it was just a pleasure being on this roundtable. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. This was so interesting. When I first read about 3D technology, I said I must learn more. And having this roundtable and having it recorded or taped means we can disseminate it and what we've learned from it far and wide. And I'm hopeful that, you know, maybe all of us can come together again, maybe in Albany, where, you know, starting in January, all the legislators will be, and we can have another form of discussion, because you've brought up some very interesting subjects that we didn't have a chance to delve into enough. So I'm really grateful to all of you for spending time here, sharing your thoughts, and thank you so much. Thank you. One thing I must say, I would like to thank my staff, my Chief of Staff, Lauren Schuster, sitting behind me, my Legislative Director, Funsho Owolabi, and Philip Johnson from Program and Development in Albany. Thank you very much.
So this is the MakerBot Cupcake CNC. It's one of MakerBot's earlier 3D printers. At this point, it's about 2.5 years old. And the way this printer basically works is on the bottom here, we have the orange print platform. And the actual platform moves around itself, which is what all these different gears do in these different guide rails. So we feed the MakerBot plastic, and it could be different types of plastics, such as PLA or ABS. Today, some of the newer printers are printing using PET, which is a different type of plastic. And I saw one this weekend that could do carbon fiber. But basically, we insert the plastic from the top, and then down here, we have a device that the computer controls, and it's an extruder that we heat up to a temperature that works for the specific plastic that we're using. And very slowly, and it does take a good deal of time, as you can see, it's now calibrated, but the additive process slowly layers different layers of plastic on top of each other, and it's very noisy, and it takes a good deal of time, but eventually, slowly over time, the additive process builds up layer by layer, and we're able to print out almost any three-dimensional design. Here we're printing a box. Yeah, we're just going to print a very small cube box. But as you can tell, it's very loud. An older model like this would not be good in an office environment. However, the newer models are significantly quieter. And it takes time. But if you can get in there, you can really see how it is slowly layering the plastic piece by piece. One of the things about this machine is it uses, just like an aircraft, uses X, Y, and Z coordinates. Because not only do we need the X and Y coordinates, but we need the Z coordinates, we need the height coordinates as well. So it truly is a three-dimensional design and device.
So how long would this box take to print?
A small box, I mean, it could take a half an hour, 45 minutes, or an hour. However, this box is so small, it should be done in about 5 minutes. We actually made a box just a few millimeters by a few millimeters, or centimeter, so that we could print it in about 5 minutes. So, yeah. And that's if things don't get jammed or if there are no failures. Once very early version of the printer, yeah.
So the newer ones are less noisy and faster.
Slightly faster, significantly less noisy, and easier to control. It looks like, just by looking at it, it looks like it was a clogged a little bit, but it's still coming out, and it's still layering the box layer by layer. It needs to allow it to harden as well. So it's
In between layers.
in between layers. So the computer program needs to take that into account.
Fascinating. There's a picture right here.
It is. The other thing we designed for educational purposes, and this was an add-on. I actually quite like this idea. For educational purposes, how do we teach what's going on here? How do we preserve it? So we created a very simple bracket that holds a web camera that we could plug right into one of our own computers, so that we could micro, we could do macro recording really close up of the device as it's printing, and that way be able to teach people how it works.
So that's innovation within innovation.
Innovation. It's all about, the type of innovation we're able to do here at John Jay. Print them right over the defendant. I don't know if it's worth waiting for it to finish up.
Yeah.
But, look at the printer's a little bit off too, but yeah. But it gives you a really good idea. Today they're smaller, they're lighter, they're cheaper, and they have better reliability.
How big is the machine?
It's about double the size of this.
And
Yeah,
that
that's
takes
double the size.
8 hours to, So the software,
The software is the most important part. It runs the hardware. Software that we're using is free, it's open source, so you don't have to pay for it. Works pretty well.
Is that true with everything?
No, and eventually, one of the things that was brought up were like the iTunes for 3D printing. I think that's realistic. 15 years out. You go to a piece of computer software, you purchase your design, it will print it right out. Whether it prints it out at home or it prints it out at your local library or your local 3D.
One day might you could print not
Very possibly.
I mean, that's something in the future.
Very far in the future.
This,
Ultimately this technology is comparable to some of the Star Trek technology, like the replicators. And I think that we've seen that Star Trek guides innovation.
Yeah.
And I think that, 100 years from now, who knows what will be. And what chemicals and molecules will be manipulated.